Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, or I guess good night. It's like really dark now. Thank you very much for coming. I know we're super excited to hear Professor Sara talk about her research. But before that, let's have a land acknowledgement. So go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So before we begin today, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that we are on the land. The land on which we gather is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. We recognize their enduring relationship with the land and express our gratitude for the opportunity to learn, gather, and build community here.
Okay, so I think I'm just gonna do a bit of introductions just because this is sort of a special event. So I'm Luke, I'm the VP Academics for the Development Economics Club. And we've partnered today with the Anthropology Student Association, so the ASA, to host the second Perspectives in Development lecture. Basically, this is a lecture series that aims to combine the different flavors of development from all the different disciplines and hopefully get a better understanding of what development looks like. So if you're interested, DevEc does a bunch of these things. We have publications, we have an Instagram, so go check us out there. You can check the banner for more information. Take it away.
Thank you. As Luke said, I'm Willow. I'm from the Anthropology Students Association. It's so great that you guys are all here, whether it's from anthropology, economics, or visiting from another faculty. We also have an Instagram that's on the poster out there. Feel free to follow it. Our events are always open to any students. So yeah, we hope to see you all in the future.
Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce you to Professor Sara Shneiderman. She's an associate professor at the Department of Anthropology here at UBC. Moreover, she is the Ivan Head South North IDRC chair at UBC's School of Public Policy and Global Affairs / Institute of Asian Research. It's a lot, but impressive. So she received her master's and PhD from Cornell and has been working continuously on a broad corpus of topics. Her work focuses primarily on social transformation, ethnicity, citizenship, and belonging in the Himalayan regions. So without boring you too much, here's Professor Sara on development, disaster, conflict, and transformation in Nepal. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Luke, for the introduction and for organizing this. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. And yeah, I think it's really, I was really pleased to be invited to speak by the Development Economics Club. As an anthropologist, I do work a lot with economists in some of the development-related work that I do, but we don't always get to have these kinds of interdisciplinary conversations. There's also a whole field of anthropology of development, which I do tend to teach a bit about in my anthropology classes, but this is a good way for me to get to say a little bit more. So nice to see some of you from Ant here too. And as Luke mentioned, there are lots of words. I put my title up there too. I hold a joint appointment, which means I'm half in the Department of Anthropology and half in School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. So I do both more traditional academic anthropology as well as applied research to engage with international development and other policy issues. I have put together a talk for you today that draws on some of those different inspirations in my own work. And my most recent research has focused on disaster and disaster aftermaths and preparedness after Nepal's 2015 earthquakes. So I'm going to be talking about that a bit, but also linking to broader themes and some bigger questions I hope we can address. So first, a question for you. Does anybody know where this picture is, or what mountain we're seeing here? A couple mountains, but actually the one on the left-hand side is a well-known peak. Sorry? Yes, the Himalayan range. Yep. Is it Annapurna? No, it's not Annapurna, but good guess. Yeah? It's not Everest, another good guess. Okay, yeah? Nope, but thanks for your efforts. Let's see, has anybody here been to or spent time in Nepal? I know you have. That's your home. Anyone else? No, okay. So this is actually a shot from the district center of Dholaka district, which is in central eastern Nepal, where I've worked for over 25 years. And the mountain on the left-hand side is Gauri Shankar. And Gauri Shankar is one of the well-known Himalayan peaks, which is a kind of double header. And it's thought to be the husband and wife of Shiva and Parvati, or Hindu deities. And so That's the view from one of the places where I've cited my work for a long time. But I started with this photo because I think it shows nicely the way that Nepal as a country is often known for its mountains and beauty. And it is also a rapidly developing country with lots of emergent urban infrastructure. And this photo shows that juxtaposition nicely. And that's the context in which I'm used to working and thinking about questions of development. So I also just wanted to frame the conversation here in relation to very recent events that people here might have heard about. For those folks who have been in my anthropology classes, you know that I usually try to link whatever it is we're talking about with current events because it helps us understand what's going on. In this case, my own long-term work about transformation in Nepal has to take account of the recent protests of this year, in which September 8th and 9th, 2025, there was a peaceful protest, which was ostensibly in response to a social media ban that the government had called by youth protesters, but it was also really about frustrations with economic stagnation and corruption. And unfortunately, 75 people were killed. It was really unexpected. Police opened fire, and then there were a series of unfolding events which led to more deaths, including over $20 billion in infrastructure losses after people set fire to especially government buildings. And so this is nearly half of Nepal's GDP. And I've put these numbers up here because I know many of you are economists. I'm not a numbers person, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of context in terms of what we're talking about here. So let me just pause and ask how many people had heard about this event earlier this year? Yeah, so it was covered in the global media and brought Nepal up to the top of the headlines just for a couple of days, as often happens. It happened earlier with the 2015 earthquakes, and before that, a couple of times during Nepal's civil conflict, which I'll come in the 90s and early 2000s, which I'll talk about more in a moment. But otherwise, Nepal is a country which is not always in global understandings of rapid economic transformation and political change. And for me, it's really important to ground the conversation in that, rather than simply thinking about it as a place where we might go to climb mountains or otherwise experience what is a beautiful country, but is much more complex than that. And so part of what I do want to talk about today is how this could have happened and what the long-term story about development in Nepal tells us about why these events might have occurred in the way that they did, but also to pose a couple of sort of conundrums for you that illustrate the complexity of what it means to talk about development and progress. Okay, so this is an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I thought I would just speak a little about anthropological approaches to development, since the economists here have done a good job at reaching out and engaging with other disciplinary perspectives. I'll then give a little bit of a historical background around the 30 years of transformation in Nepal, and then present a couple of ethnographic moments from my own research, focusing on conflict, disaster, and different forms of development, and then close with a couple of questions for us to keep considering. Something else I want to say about that. Oh yes, just what does ethnographic mean for people who might not be familiar with that? It's the primary methodology we use in anthropology, and basically it means that we spend a lot of time in a place and hang out and really get to know people. So it's an immersive qualitative methodology where instead of dropping in for just a short time or looking at big data figures or kind of bird's eye view information, we're going from the ground up and trying to understand how people live their lives, why people do the things that they do, and documenting that through different kinds of strategies like participant observation, interviews, sometimes surveys or focus group discussions. I also use photography in my ethnographic work, and that's something that I've done for a long time. So I'll be showing you quite a few photos, which are kind of part of the argument of what I'll be sharing with you. They're not just illustrative, they actually contain analysis of the circumstances that I'm talking about. Okay, so first of all, though, just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is development and how do we know it when we see it? And that's a question for all of you. Do you have a definition that you can offer of what development is? And or what kinds of material things could you see or notice in a place that might tell you that it has development or not? Yeah. Right, so transitions, did you say between stages? Okay, and like evidence of services maybe, like public health care? What else? Yeah. Great, yeah, increasing living standards.
Along the healthcare aspect, increasing mortality, less childbirth, less death in general.
Uh-huh. Anything else? Like if you walked into a place and you were asking yourself, is this place developed or not? What are the things that would be indicators of that to you that you could see, just in observing a place? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Public infrastructure. And some of those might be roads, sanitation, bridges, hydropower, electricity, other kinds of services. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, internet, great. Connectivity, internet, mobile services, all the things you need to stay in touch. I'm just going to move this because I think I'm going to bump into it. Yeah, great. Those are all really good ideas, and thank you for being active and contributing to a conversation even in the evening. Probably everybody's had a long day in class already, but I think this will be most fun if we can have it as a dialogue, especially because it's a small group. So I put this question up here not because there's one clear or definitive definition, but rather to get us thinking. Oops, sorry, did I lose my image there? Yeah, I did. Okay, there we go. So there, in kind of traditional thinking about development, there are a series of binaries which often shape how we think about a place or people being developed or not developed. A lot of recent work has challenged that. And in fact, we might no longer even want to use terms like developed or underdeveloped or developing nation. The UN, for instance, now uses lower and middle income countries rather than developed and not developed or underdeveloped. So just a little prompt here to think about our terminologies. But these are some of the assumptions that are often baked in to ideas of what development is. That it encodes, somebody said a transition between stages, that it encodes a transition between traditional and modern lifestyles, what's often called backwards. That's a term that comes up a lot in South Asia and Nepal and India and other parts of that region. Backwards versus forwards ways of living. Often it's linked to ideas of ruralness or rurality and urbanization or urban lifestyles, villages and cities. Different modes of production, so subsistence agriculture, where you're growing your food to eat, versus working as a wage laborer to earn cash to buy your food. Self-made things like clothing versus mass-produced clothing. Ideas of stasis or regression, like staying the same and not progressing through change, versus forward movement or progress. And ideas of progress in all kinds of languages are often baked into or connected with ideas of development. And then ultimately the idea of being in poverty versus having wealth. So please know I'm not promoting this as a way to think that we should be thinking about development. Instead, I'm trying to deconstruct it to suggest that these are assumptions which often guide the way discussions or assumptions of development unfold. And I've put this image here because it helps to explain how development is not necessarily a linear progress that's always moving forward, but can also have lots of side steps or tangents or actually move backwards. And that's because this is a signboard at the gate that welcomes you to Dholaka district, which is the area of Nepal where I've worked for a long time. And it says, "Thank you for visiting open defecation-free Nepal." And this was a major development initiative of the government of Nepal through the 1990s and 2000s, which was supported by a whole host of international donors, including USAID and also local or national NGOs like this one called CBAC Nepal. You can see all the logos there. And the goal was to ensure that people everywhere had toilets. Open defecation means when you're going to the bathroom, not in the bathroom, but when you have to go out to the woods or a river or some other kind of location. And when I started working in this part of Nepal in the late 1990s, many people were doing that, and a lot of households just didn't have toilets. We could talk more later if people are interested about why that was the case. But in any case, over the intervening couple of decades, there were so many different projects and programs to build toilets, and people really did make a massive behavior change. And by the early to mid-2000s, it was very rare to see people not using a toilet, as had been the case in the past in this area. And this district was actually certified as an open defecation-free district. And they were so proud of it that it was even on this signboard welcoming you to the area. So the interesting thing about that, however, is that when the major earthquakes hit in 2015, many, many toilets, as well as all kinds of other infrastructure, were destroyed. And I'll show you images of that a bit later. And they had just achieved this goal of open defecation-free district of Dolakha at the time that the earthquakes hit, just a few years before that. And then, in a sense, it was over. So that's just one example of how even if you have very significant indicators of development progress, that can also be undone by another kind of change or crisis. It might be a natural disaster, it might be political upheaval, or it might be some other kind of behavior change that for some reason people just decide they want to do something else and they stop using whatever it was they built. So that's just a kind of way of thinking about the fluidity of these kinds of categories that I have up on this slide here. That can help us think about development as more of a process and a fluid space which can move in all of these different directions. I have a couple of quotations here that help define development from anthropological perspectives. The first one is from Stacy Pigg, who is actually a colleague at SFU, who wrote a very influential article in the early 1990s about social representations and development in Nepal. And she wrote then, so this is already more than 30 years ago, development might be defined as a process of social transformation that is brought about by specific programs, projects, and policies. At least this is the institutional self-conception of development. In Nepal, development has a different, more profoundly social meaning, a meaning that weaves bikas, which is the word for development, into the fabric of local life and patterns Nepalese national society. And this piece has been quite influential, not only in anthropologies of development in Nepal, but actually globally. And if you look at a lot of scholarship about Latin America, Africa, other parts of the world by anthropologists, they'll often be citing this piece, which was one of the first by an anthropologist to really take on this category of development and try to deconstruct it from the kind of sociocultural inside out. The second quote is from Nanda Shrestha, who is a Nepali development worker who became a scholar, eventually settled in the US. And he has this really interesting piece called Becoming a Development Category, where he talks about his own growing up experience in this context in Nepal, where development was treated in the way the first quote sets it up. And he talks about how for him it became this category of aspiration. He really wanted to be a developed person. He thought that education was the way to do that and had all kinds of other markers of what it would mean to be developed. But ultimately, after he goes on to his graduate degree and becomes a critical development studies scholar, he comes to realize, and he writes about really powerfully in this autobiographical piece, that it was almost a form of colonization of his own mind. The idea that development should be the aspiration for someone like him who grew up in a village in rural Nepal. And I've just selected this one quote here where he says, "In the name of bikas, the dignity and humanity of the poor were questioned, while poverty itself deepened. We accepted development as a fait accompli. We seem to have convinced ourselves that more bikas meant less poverty. what a fallacy. And the piece in general kind of adds more grist to that mill, and where he's really showing how the influx of development dollars didn't necessarily lead to actual improvement in livelihood standards, which I think was what we were talking about here earlier. And again, that's a 1995 piece. So these are older critiques which have been around for a long time. And much development work since then has sought to respond to that and to kind of correct course and address some of these issues. Nonetheless, there are still these kind of pervasive ways in which people use this terminology in Nepal, where people will talk about certain places or people or ethnic groups as developed in contrast to others who are not, or backwards, et cetera. And that's quite a pernicious way, in a sense, of thinking about oneself as not having something that one should have. So ultimately here, one of the things that Shrestha's article does for us too is to kind of frame development as not just something which is brought from the outside to people receiving it, but to think more broadly about who can be a development actor. So I'll put that question out to you all as well. What are the kinds of institutions or individuals we might understand as part of the development process? Yeah. Yeah, NGOs, yeah. IMF, yeah, so I would call that a multilateral organization. So IMF, UN, World Bank, these large global organizations that are funded by various countries around the world, yeah. Yeah, private sector, companies, corporations often which have corporate social responsibility elements of their portfolio. Anything else? Yeah? Yeah, people in the community might be development actors. Yeah. The government. Yes, government, local, national, provincial, different scales of government. Yeah, so those are all great ideas. This is my list. It's probably not exhaustive, but I think it captures all of the things that you just said. And my point in bringing this whole list here, again, from an anthropological perspective, is to help us see that development is a multidimensional field, which is not just about large international organizations or governments doing something to people or bringing something to people, but it's also from the ground up about people deciding how they themselves want to live their lives or improve their livelihoods and taking on various projects to do so. And these are a couple of images which just show some of these different kinds of configurations. The one on the top is just the front cover of a booklet that I happen to have around about Nepal-Swiss development partnership marking 50 years, which shows villagers working, looks like on a construction project. The other one on the bottom is members of a community-based organization that I've been an advisor to for several years in this same area of Dolaka that I have been talking about and will ground the rest of this presentation in. So development actors are multitudinous and are engaged with each other in complex and often fraught power relationships as well, depending on their positionalities, where they're coming from, what kind of resources they do or don't have access to. So ultimately, from an anthropological perspective, and this is my definition here, we can see development as a relational field of knowledge and practice, which is constituted by multiple actors, which indexes both connections and gaps between global and local. And that part is really important because part of the rhetoric of development, as the quotes that I showed earlier demonstrate, is that it brings people in all kinds of localities all over the world into this vision of a shared and unified future prosperity. So that's the global part. But the local part is that vision has to be realized in a localized fashion everywhere in the world, whether that's here in Vancouver or whether it's in Dolaka, Nepal. So it's a kind of conceptual framework which is connecting people across global and local with these shared ideas. It also, the second part of this, it also shapes subjectivities, which are individual ideas of self in relation to material resources and perceptions of progress. And that's coming back to the Nanda Shrestha quote, the idea that the concept of development is something that people relate to and orient themselves towards, and may place themselves on a hierarchy depending on what kinds of resources they think they have access to, what they see as aspirations, and how they envision themselves as an actor in this domain. This image that I've put up here is a wall painting from a Buddhist monastery in another area of Nepal, Sindhupalchok district, which is just adjacent to Dholaka. And you can see the electric switch that's on the wall that it's painted over. And this is actually a painting in the traditional style of Tibetan Buddhist wall paintings, but that's documenting or showing what the process of post-earthquake reconstruction looked like in this area. And I put this image up here to really illustrate that idea of self-making, people expressing themselves and their own ideas about what development is, or what kind of buildings they want to live in, what kind of infrastructure they imagine, and that's done as a mode of expression in this community space. Yes, you had a question. Can you speak up a little? Sorry. That's a great question. I wouldn't say that it's inseparable from globalization, in that you could have development from a local perspective, what people want and how they envision their own sense of progress, that's not actually dictated or mandated by any global framework. However, the reality is, in our interconnected world, that in most cases, people are developing their notion, I shouldn't say developing, people are framing their notions of what development is in relation to a global framework. So even for people who are living in rural Nepal, where I work, everybody's connected, everybody's got phones. Even before phones, there were other forms of connectivity. And so it's a way in which people are kind of orienting themselves to a broader world. But I mean, what I'm also trying to say, and why it says that it indexes connections and gaps between global and local, is that sometimes ideas and also material processes of development are driven by global actors. Other times, they're very local in nature. And basically what I'm talking about here is that development as a whole is kind of where those two things meet, if that makes some sense. Sorry, my throat is actually a little sore, so. Okay, so now we have our definitions down, so we can talk a little bit about history. So I'm not going to go into all of this in detail. It's so much information. We could talk more about it in Q&A if people are interested in particular parts of it. But the relevant part is that Nepal is a country which experimented with democracy very briefly in the 1950s, and then was under basically a monarchical rule from 1960 to 1990, at which point there was a people's movement, a social movement which demanded a return to democracy. Multi-party democracy began after 1990. But soon after that, a civil conflict emerged between Maoist insurgents. So it was the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, and they were basically drawing upon Maoist ideology to launch a people's war. And there was a 10-year-long civil conflict between Maoist insurgents and state forces. I first went to Nepal in 1994. I almost put myself into the timeline, and then I thought that's not really a good idea, but I can just share that with you verbally. So I first went there over 30 years ago. I was a university student at the time. I was 19 years old, so that always makes me feel old when I say that, but it's been 30 plus years since I've been spending time in this part of the world. So in a way, many of these transformations are very personal for me as well. I went there on a study abroad program where I learned Nepali and lived with a homestay family, and I had such a really transformative time for myself that I wanted to go back, and I did go back as soon as I graduated undergrad, and then I lived there for 4 years working in different capacities, some related to development. And then I went back to do my PhD, which also focused on Nepal. And anyway, here I am. So the point is that I've been observing all of these transformations up close since 1994 and spent quite a lot of time doing my PhD research actually during the civil conflict. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. In 2006, there was a second people's movement, which led to the formal end of the conflict. It also deposed the then king and led to a comprehensive peace agreement. Part of the some of the terms of those was that Nepal would transition from being a Hindu state to being a secular state, and that it would also transition from being a unitary country that didn't have any system of provinces or states the way we do here in Canada or in the US, to becoming a federal system. And so all of that was part of the terms of the peace agreement. And in some ways, the implementation process began in 2008 with the election of a constituent assembly, but it wasn't completed. That transition wasn't completed for quite some time. And between 2006 and 2017, a process of what was called post-conflict state restructuring ensued, where the entire administrative configuration of the country was changed to reflect the principles that I just mentioned of federalization and secularization. That was called Punar-Samrachana, so literally state restructuring. And in the middle of that process, there were two massive earthquakes in spring of 2015, which I've put in the middle of this timeline just to emphasize the importance, but also to emphasize the fact that that natural disaster occurred at a time when this political transformation was still ongoing. So things were kind of up in the air already, and they were then up in the air even more once much of the material infrastructure, at least in a central zone of 14 districts of the country, was severely devastated. In a sense, the earthquakes led to the process of promulgating a constitution in 2015, and I won't get into all the details of that here, but there had been a lot of political infighting and bickering and back and forth about what that constitution should look like. And in some ways, or from some perspectives, the 2015 Constitution of Nepal was a product of donor pressure, because after the earthquakes of 2015, international donors got together. There was a conference to pledge, I think, $4 billion in relief and reconstruction funding, but the donors' condition was that the country had to finally promulgate its constitution after this long conflict, and so that happened. There are all kinds of positive things, but also some shortcomings about the 2015 Constitution. One of the things that it did was to administratively reorganize the country. That happened through elections in 2017. And then at the same time, the whole process of post-earthquake reconstruction unfolded. So from 2015 to 2021, formally, the country was in a process of post-earthquake reconstruction with all of this donor funding and a government, central government-run program for private housing reconstruction, which rebuilt almost 1 million houses. And that program and its outcomes for people in rural areas is what my most recent research has focused on, and I'll show you a bit more about that soon. And so at the same time that you have state restructuring or Punar-Samrachana, you also have Punar-Nirman or post-disaster reconstruction. And I put up those Nepali terms also to kind of indicate how in Nepali, but also in English, there's a kind of resonance between them, this idea of redoing something, restructuring the state, but also reconstructing the built environment. And so from my perspective, those two things have gone hand in hand, and people's sense of political consciousness as actors able to basically implement the kind of development we were talking about earlier has gone alongside their own reconstruction of homes and other kinds of infrastructure, at least in the parts of Nepal that were affected by the earthquakes, which is where I've focused my work. So in that infrastructural transformation that has occurred and is ongoing, there are three main sectors, and I'm going to show photos of all of these in a moment. One of them is housing, and if you think about the fact that nearly 1 million houses were destroyed, that's a huge project of rebuilding infrastructure. In a way, it's a kind of intimate infrastructure where it's people's own households, but each house had to be rebuilt. Also hospitals, schools, et cetera. Hydropower is another really big part of ongoing infrastructural transformation with many, many huge contracts from both international companies as well as Nepali national companies developing hydropower all over the country's northern regions in the Himalayas, where there is a lot of water resources which are really abundant for hydropower development. And so that's one of the directions the country is going in terms of generating income, but also generating electricity. And then finally, road building has been massive over the last 2 decades. I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but there's been an exponential growth in kilometerage of road over the country, and I'll show you photos in a couple of minutes. But basically the areas that I work in, when I first went there in the mid to late 1990s, there was only a road coming from the capital city of Kathmandu to the district center, and then you had to get out and walk. Now, everywhere that I walk to in that area is accessible by road, and it's an entirely different situation in terms of connectivity, people's ability to move distance, but also to transport goods. So then finally, the last thing I have on this timeline is this year, which I've already spoken about, the recent protests and elections that are called for the coming March, and we'll see what happens. So anyway, I'm not expecting anybody to remember all of this. I'm just offering it as context, because the next part of what I'm going to do is to kind of take you through a series of photos and tell some stories about particular people in particular places, and also ask some questions. But this is kind of critical background to help understand what I'm talking about. In short, it's a country that's been through a lot in a very short period of time. A lot has changed politically, a lot has changed infrastructurally and in terms of the built environment, and a lot has changed in terms of people's connectivity and access to resources. Okay, so this is the area that I'm talking about, where I work. And just to give you a little bit of a better sense, you can see the map of Nepal on the top corner. India is to the south, China, the Tibetan Autonomous Region is to the north, and that little red box is this area of Dholaka district. So it's in the Himalayan region, as you saw from my starting photo. And the bigger map in the middle is actually the district of Dholaka. This is an older map before the political restructuring, because it shows you the area where I work, which is called Suspa Chemawati. So it was formerly called Suspa Chemawati Village Development Committee. It then became a municipality in the new configuration, and it became a ward of a larger municipal area. So this is the road leading into the village. The first picture on the left is from 2003, and the one on the right is from 2023. And you can see significant change. In the first picture, I'm standing at the homestead where I've stayed with the family I've lived with over all this time. In the second one, I'm standing down on the road itself. But in the first one, you can see that it's a very narrow dirt track winding through the forest. On the second one, it's been widened and it's been pitched, blacktopped. It's got painted lines and markers along the side of the road. So this is very significant development, and this is a major road which leads from the district headquarters of Cherikot to a big hydropower project called the Upper Tamakosi Hydropower Project, which is actually Nepal's currently largest operational hydropower project. So we're still about 50 kilometers away from the hydropower project at this point, but the road was built in order to access it and to enable heavy equipment to go up to that project. So that significantly changed the connectivity situation for people in this region as well, and that's been one of the benefits of large-scale hydropower development. Interestingly, the electricity that's generated from that project doesn't go to these villages. It's sold primarily to India, and that project has had a very interesting history where it's one of the first ones where shares were offered to local community members as part of an IPO, public offering. So everybody who lives in this area, in theory, can benefit from that large hydropower project by becoming a share owner. But the challenge in that is that most people who live in this area had never had any kind of financial education or didn't know what it meant to do that. So it's been a sort of incomplete financial benefit from the hydropower project itself. But the road has changed life significantly. People are now able to access health services, access education, and transport goods, both their own agricultural goods to market much more effectively, as well as bringing things in like mass-produced clothing, et cetera. Now, I want to that's kind of sense of the place and how it's changed over 25 years. I now want to talk about the civil conflict a bit more, which I mentioned in the historical overview, but ask this key question of whether conflict emerges due to lack of development or too much of it. And now that might seem like a funny question, but in the initial years of this civil conflict, which lasted for a decade, a lot of the analyses from development actors in Nepal, for instance, a large research project funded by USAID, came to the conclusion that the reason there was a far-left communist insurgency was because there wasn't enough development and people wanted more development, more infrastructure, more education, et cetera. But later on, as the conflict wore on, and after the conflict, more recent research by several colleagues, both Nepali and foreign, has shown that in fact it's the other way around, and that many of the people who became enrolled as Maoist insurgents or became part of the People's Liberation Army, in fact, had been part of local development initiatives and had often taken part in what are usually called trainings by different development organizations, and in a sense had become familiar with a language for expressing aspiration for something better. And that language was about equality, it was about empowerment, it was about actually gaining something in order to benefit their lives, which were mired in poverty. And so the rhetoric of development, which was about those kinds of aspirations, once it seemed that it was really difficult to actually make those changes, also led people to go for a social movement, which eventually became a violent mobilization. And some of that work is published by my colleague Dinesh Podel in a journal, Development and Change. And another piece that attests to this is by Lauren Leave in Anthropological Quarterly. Sorry, I didn't get to including quotations from them, but I'm happy to share those references if people are interested. But basically, both of those scholars and others, based on ethnographic work where they interviewed many people who had been participants in the Maoist movement, basically they make the argument that it's not that people didn't have enough development, but in fact that the rhetoric of development itself, this way that it can shift subjectivities, was part of what led people to a violent mobilization when the results of what they were hoping development would achieve didn't actually happen quickly. So that's one kind of interesting puzzle to think through, and in a sense is a precursor or offers the same kind of analysis that might be useful to apply to the current circumstances that I talked about earlier as unfolding this year in Nepal, and I'll come back to that at the end. And so just one more image here from the village. This is a flag from the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, and this is just one of the ingenious ways that local people use materials that come their way. This flag was used to patch a mattress in the house that I was staying in. And the family whom I live with were not themselves in the People's Liberation Army, but they had to host Maoist cadres when they came through the village, as well as they also had to host or communicate with army when they came through the village. And just to go back to the road, you can also see that this road into the village might have been a thoroughfare which enabled different kinds of actors to come through the village, whether they were Maoist insurgents or members of the state forces. So the family who I lived with had to basically interface with both parties, but benefited from certain kinds of material stuff being left behind like this. And this is just kind of one image of how political transformation might get embroidered literally into day-to-day life. Okay, so by the mid-2000s, and sorry, I'll leave that one out for now. The mid-2000s, and this is an article from 2013, there was a lot of international fanfare about the fact that Nepal's poverty indicators were dropping rapidly. And this seemed like kind of a surprise to a lot of people who were watching closely what had happened on the ground in Nepal, because there had been this long-term civil conflict. Then once it was over in 2006, this kind of ongoing, long drawn-out political transformation where there was no constitution yet in 2013. And yet these economic indicators were going up. And so part of that puzzle has to do with the fact that Nepal has relied on labor migration and the income from labor migration, which are often called remittances, for a very long time. So not the only reason, but the main reason that Nepal's GDP was going up and up was not because the government of Nepal was able to do more to increase income or livelihood standards at home, but rather because more and more people were becoming educated, realizing they might not have employment with the education that they had gotten at home, and that they wanted to go out to make money elsewhere. So many Nepalis work all over the world, particularly in the Gulf states, in Dubai, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, also increasingly in Malaysia, Japan, Korea. And of course, there are large Nepali diasporas here in Canada, as well as in the US and Europe. So by the early 2000s, or mid-2000s, remittances were accounting for approximately a quarter of the country's GDP, and that number has fluctuated up and down. So this is a kind of interesting part of the puzzle, that you have a country which is struggling with political upheaval, violence, and challenges to development, and yet people are finding these pathways to go elsewhere, make money, and send it home. And that's then enabling community members to build big concrete buildings like the ones that I showed you in the starting image in the district center of Cherrycoat, to put their children into private education, and to do all kinds of other things, which then begin to increase living standards. Again, it's not only about remittances, it's 25%. The rest of it is coming from somewhere else. So there are also these dynamics of improvement on the ground through government as well as international initiatives, but that piece of migration really needs to be figured into understanding what's happened in Nepal. Okay, so now I want to talk about the natural disasters of 2015. Although these questions are really about any kind of disaster, not only an earthquake, and Nepal also suffers from seasonal monsoon flooding and landsliding. One of the recent research projects I've been involved with is about landsliding as a form of disaster, and has basically worked in the same area as well as several other parts of Nepal to try to understand how to mitigate that. So I asked a question earlier about conflict and development. Another one here is whether development makes disasters worse or better. And then the kind of counterpart question is, what is the best way to aid communities in building back better, both structurally and socially, after a major disaster, whether we're talking about an earthquake, landslide, fire, or flood? And by the way, those are questions that are very relevant here as well, and in many other parts of the world, not only in Nepal. I'm asking them in this context because it's where I do my work, but I also do research on these themes here in BC now as well, building upon experiences in the Nepali context. So this image is from the same village I've been talking about all along the way. It's from August 2015, 4 months after the earthquakes hit. And it gives you a little bit of a sense of what some of that infrastructural damage looks like. And this, unfortunately, was how most people's houses looked after the earthquake. So it was a really, really difficult time. And I'm sorry if it's also traumatic material. I've included some figures there about people who died and were injured and houses that were destroyed. So these are some of the real challenges that people in this context have faced. And my question about does development make disasters worse is because a lot of the post-earthquake analysis has also looked at how some of the trajectories of infrastructural development has potentially exacerbated some of the after effects of the earthquake. And these are two of the forms of development which may improve livelihoods in the ways I've just been talking about the positive elements of road building and hydropower, but might also exacerbate disaster. So on the left, this is one of the hydropower pylons, which is in the same village. You can see it's right in the middle of people's fields. And people have a lot of concern about that. They worry about whether they might get electrocuted, especially when they're doing irrigated rice paddy farming. And there's a sense of a kind of instability and concern about what having this tower means in their own fields. As I mentioned already, people in this area, for instance, my friends who are working the fields there, do not actually receive that electricity. That's not what's powering their homes. They're connected to the national grid. That electricity is being sold elsewhere. But they are all shareholders. Everybody in that image is a shareholder in this large national hydropower project. So there's some benefit there, but there's also this sense of potential risk. That would be another way to frame the question, not does development make disaster worse, but does development increase risk? And I think there's a pretty clear sense that it may reduce some kinds of risks, but it may also increase others. The other image here is of one of the many local roads just around the corner, about 15 minutes walk from the site of that hydropower pole. And you can see how the slope is basically eroding. And many of these local roads have not been properly surveyed or built in a way that has the right technical specifications or engineering to prevent against landslide. So you can see that this slope is subsiding. And in many places, roads get washed out every summer due to the monsoon. Moreover, there's quite a bit of scholarship published now by colleagues who are physical geographers and geologists showing that the cutting of roads through this mountainous terrain actually exacerbated the negative effects of the 2015 earthquake. So that poses a real conundrum for us because people want roads. These are not roads that are built because somebody is forcing it upon them. These are things that local people really want. Surveys over time, over multiple years, show that what Nepali citizens ask of from their local governments is road building. It's the biggest request. So it's something that people really want. It's the way they often see their own development aspirations, but it's also something which may lead to disaster risk and other kinds of hardship, again, undoing some of the accomplishments of development in the same way that I was talking about at the beginning. How am I doing on time? Okay. So overall here, I've talked about three drivers of transformation in this local context. Really three forms of infrastructural development: road building, hydropower, and post-earthquake reconstruction, which over the last several years that I've been observing have been reconfiguring labor markets and settlement patterns in conjunction with shifting migration opportunities. So really part of what I'm saying here, and this comes back to this question about the entanglement of global and local, is that in order to understand the process and outcomes of development in Nepal, we need to understand both infrastructural development in place in these particular localities, but also patterns of migration and travel and movement outside, because that's also driving shifts in the labor market as well as shifts in people's income earning capacity. And all of that together shapes the form of what we see now. So I'm going to just talk a little bit more about some of the transformations with the post-earthquake reconstruction of housing, just because this illustrates some more of the kind of details from one family's perspective. And this is a series of photos which just shows you the transformation of one homestead, and this is the house that I've been fortunate to be hosted in since the late 1990s. This is what it looked like in 2003, and you can see the house in the foreground is the one that I usually live in. The one on the side has a thatched roof, which is an older style of roofing. That belonged to my host's brother, and he hadn't upgraded his house to the tin roof, which my host had already done by 2003. And that tin roof, if you asked people in the village where I work, what is development and how do you know it when you see it, this is one of the things they would say, having a tin roof. That's a sign of a developed or a kind of modern house for many people in these areas. So you can kind of see the contrast there. But already by 2015, and this is 1 month before the earthquakes hit, younger brother had also upgraded his house, and you can now see that that house was really large, had 2 stories, and the tin roof. And one of the reasons I like to show these pre-earthquake photos too is that often in post-disaster humanitarian response, which then kind of often morphs into longer-term development programming, there's kind of an assumption that the disaster is the kind of 0 point and that everybody's a victim who then needs to be kind of helped or supported to build the basic elements of survival. On some levels, that's true. On other levels, people who were earthquake affected had really robust and quite beautiful houses that they had already worked hard over the previous decade to a few decades to really improve, and you could see that there was actually a fairly high standard of living for a village context right before the earthquakes. So that was part of the sadness of the destruction that occurred, and one close friend of mine said to me something like, we were developed when the earthquakes hit, but that disaster's taken us back 30 years, and now we have to start all over again. And yet he also had the sense of his own capacity, his own agency, and his own knowledge and experience in terms of what he wanted that post-earthquake environment to look like. This is the same house right after the earthquake, so you can see the kind of level of destruction there. It wasn't livable. And this is an intermediate phase. That's in August 2015, where they had to go through a process of deconstruction before they could think about reconstruction. They had to remove all that rubble that you see here and create a kind of space where something could be rebuilt. At that point, it was actually used as an animal shelter. And the family themselves, whom you see here, were living in a temporary shelter made of tin. And as I mentioned already, that was kind of a status symbol, but previously it was only for roofs, and then suddenly it became for all forms of habitation. So that was the kind of transition people had to go through. These are some images of what you would have seen inside some of those temporary shelters in that time frame, a year or two out after the earthquake. So I counted at that point sorry, not a year or two, a few months after the earthquake, there were over 14 different branded supplies from different international organizations in this one small village area, and some of them were from Canada, from the Korean Red Cross, Habitat for Humanity. And this also comes to the global local question, very rural, local environment, and yet people are clearly deeply integrated into a global economy where all of these countries are sending relief and aid supplies as well as NGO organizations. They weren't always used, the supplies weren't always used the way they were supposed to be. The Habitat for Humanity thing was meant to be a water jug for storing clean water, but people in this community often use them to store homemade alcohol instead, which wasn't necessarily what the donors had anticipated. So that just gives you a little bit of a sense of the texture of some of these unexpected outcomes. These are my hosts for the last 25 years. And this is the documentation that they had to put together to get their post-earthquake reconstruction housing grant. They had to sign an agreement with the government to receive funding to rebuild their house of about $3,000. They also had to open up a bank account. And so this comes back to this point I was making earlier about people not being enrolled in a global financial system. Well, now they are. Whoever wanted to access those reconstruction funds needed to open a bank account. So you basically have a process by which hundreds of thousands of rural families and households became enrolled in global financial systems in order to access relief and support. And that could be seen as a positive thing. It could also be seen potentially as a negative thing if they also become subject to, say, predatory lending and other things like that. This is then an image from the same village of the specifications for how people had to rebuild. And there were very specific ways in which they needed to build their houses in order to access the full funding. And here you can see the house under construction. And again, this is my host in the foreground in the red shirt. And he was actually a very skilled carpenter who had always built his own houses before. And so similar to the example I was giving previously, he was also a bit frustrated that suddenly he had to have an agreement with the government, a bank book, and he had to meet all of these particular kinds of specifications in order to be recognized as having an earthquake-safe home. At the same time, you can see the construction here actually includes concrete reinforcement at various levels of the house. And that is something that had never been part of traditional construction. So this was a real benefit, and many people in this area came to realize that actually they were building safer houses, even if it wasn't exactly the kind of house they wanted to have before, or had before. And so there was a sort of negotiation between local knowledge and aspirations for development, and then global ones, which informed the national reconstruction program, because the donors that funded that program were all of was basically the global community. This is what the house looked like at the end. And these, again, are my hosts here under their new address plate. And this is maybe another feature of development. There had never been numerical addresses in this area before. There hadn't been in many parts of rural Nepal, but through this whole process of reconstruction, the government rolled out a kind of metric for addresses. So people are now also able to use that to receive other kinds of services. But again, there are sort of ambivalent outcomes here where there was a sense of satisfaction that they had a home, especially after living in temporary shelters for so long. Also that it was probably safer in terms of engineering specifications, but it was much smaller and didn't have all kinds of features for cultural practice and home life that earlier houses had. And the kind of enrollment in things like bank accounts and also government services through the addresses was in a sense positive because it gave people a sense of belonging to the state and also being able to make claims on it, but also had a little bit of a feeling of surveillance to many people of having to do things in a way they wouldn't have done otherwise. Yeah, you had a question. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the way you put it is appropriate. There are trade-offs, basically, and so that somehow needs to be adjudicated. And I think it's really important not to use those binaries that I introduced at the beginning, like, oh, village people are traditional and they only want traditional things. No, like in this case, in the research that I've done, which included several hundred interviews and focus group discussions and so forth, in general, not only, but in general, people were really pleased that they learned how to build safer, more earthquake resilient houses. It was really scary, and a lot of people died and were injured, and there was a lot of property and other kind of asset loss. So nobody wanted to have that happen again. So there was a sense of, great appreciation for that. At the same time, there was the sense of it could have been negotiated better. And yeah, to answer your question, quite often, international donors have a sort of lip service to local knowledge and or traditional knowledge and or indigenous knowledge, and all of those terms are used in sort of different overlapping ways. But often the structure of how programs are set up doesn't actually allow for the timeline that would be necessary to do really meaningful consultations to basically understand the answer to the question that you're asking. So smaller NGOs often do that better, but often their funding is also from a larger organization, and they're also on tight timelines with reporting restrictions and that sort of thing. So yeah, it can be a bit ambivalent, and there are definitely real success stories too. I mean, my own take with the post-earthquake reconstruction program in Nepal is that there was a real missed opportunity. They could have done a much better job with consulting with different communities to understand what they wanted, and also offer technologies for building safer houses. It shouldn't have been framed as one or the other, and often it was, even though that wasn't the intention from the donor side. Yeah. Another good question. I think it varies significantly on the context. There's no one answer to that. A lot of scholarly literature about disaster reconstruction in different parts of the world does show that it creates opportunities. So this is part of what my current research is about too. Like, how do people think about it? When your house is leveled and your political system is also in this period of transformation, you really have to think about what you want, because nothing is made for you. So it creates this moment for people to really reconceptualize their world, how they want it to be, but whether people actually have the resources to implement that or not is another question. And then yes, people become really exhausted after 2 or 3 years of living in a temporary shelter that was meant to be, that became permanent but was meant to be temporary. Eventually, if somebody comes and says, okay, just build your house this way and I'll give you the money, you're kind of going to do it because you want your house. I mean, that's a kind of simple way of putting it, which tends more towards the conservative side that you were speaking of. But my own view is that there's a kind of balance of those two elements. And yes, after a disaster is a really important time for any community or country, whatever the scale of community is, to think about what that future should really look like. And I mean, one of the important things to do is to think about that before there's a disaster, so that you have an opportunity to actually implement some of that if you do face something like this. I just have a couple more slides, so I'll wrap up and then we can have a few more questions, a bit more discussion. So this is the last image here. This is from January 2023, and this is that same homestead, which has already been expanded even further. If you can see from this, it's a little bit of a different angle. But also my hostess, so the woman here, whom is a very, very close friend over several decades, in the most recent work that I've done there, and I should have said, I continue to go back to this area usually once or twice a year. Sometimes it's every 2 years, but it's kind of, this is what anthropologists do, longitudinal studies and engagement. So I have a time depth and relationships with individuals as well as with the community as a whole to look at change over time. So she said to me in one of our last conversations, which was just in spring 25, but although this picture is from January 23, she said, it's happened now. We've become developed. And that was a kind of unprompted comment. Of course, she knew the kinds of questions I had been asking about these themes for a long time. But she was like, look, the road is here. Our house is finally rebuilt. We're making a reasonable income. Her son is a migrant laborer in India, actually. He hasn't gone further afield like many people have to the countries I mentioned earlier. But he makes a good income working in India. And she basically was like, we can relax now. We rebuilt after the earthquake. The road comes almost right up to our doorstep. We have phones and internet connectivity. These were all the kind of markers that she was using. But she said it almost jokingly, but it was also really interesting to me because for such a long time, I had heard this kind of mantra of like, oh, we need development, we're not developed, we're looking for this thing. And now it's like, it's actually arrived. So then my next question to her was, well, you know, what do you need next? Or what are the things you were still seeking? And the thing that she said was, I want my son to come home and to not have to work abroad in order to keep us well provided for. And that's also something that comes up in a lot of the recent interviews that I've been doing. So in short, people feel like infrastructurally and materially, life is much better. Infrastructure is good. Services, health, and education are much better than they were a couple decades ago. And yet the kind of trade-off for that has been the extreme suffering they faced during both the conflict and the disaster. But then more recently, the strain that it puts on families to rely upon remittance economies for infrastructural or economic development. So that's a kind of rounding up of all of these themes. So this is the kind of last big set of ideas here, and just to end with some questions. How do we interpret outcomes of safer houses, more infrastructure, empowered local governments, and increased GDP in relation to protests against economic stagnation and corruption? And that's what those protests and violence this year in September seem to have been about. So some of the kind of loose ends here, which are factors to consider, and why this might be the case, is that there are still really significant urban and rural differentials. I have spoken really about one area of rural Nepal, and I didn't compare or contrast that with indicators or lifestyles in urban areas, but they're very different. And of course, there's also a very significant urban poor who don't have access to elite lifestyles. There are also ongoing caste, ethnic, regional, and class inequalities across the country. The global experiences of migration create new expectations, and that's a big part of the picture here. When you're working abroad in Saudi Arabia or Malaysia for 3 or 4 years, and you come home and you think, why does my village not have all of these resources that I saw in the place I was working? That then makes you want something different. That migration also puts a really significant strain on family relationships and resources. And then finally, there's the ongoing transformations of global, regional, and national political orders where people may be seeing their own fortune shift in relation to other kinds of global transformations. And as one example of that, I have a last couple of slides just showing different views of the US from Nepal. This is a local bus which, says USA, United States of America on the side, also in this same area with the deity Ganesh in the front. And I don't know if you can see, I don't have a pointer here, but on that door, kind of up at the front, there's actually like an American, presumably military figure with a machine gun. So there's this sort of desiring or of aspiration to a certain kind of global hegemony or military power, which is valued as something people see as positive about the US. At the same time, there's a really complicated set of political dynamics around US investment in Nepal. There was a really controversial program called the Millennium Challenge Compact, where the US pledged $500 million. And this was an agreement that was signed in 2022. And you can see their logo here has all the things I've just been talking about, hydropower and roads as a kind of sign, as a symbol of future prosperity in Himalayan Nepal, as a partnership between the US and Nepal with flags. But it was really controversial when it was first on the table, and the graffiti in this other photo here says "Go Back MCC," and it's political graffiti from an even further left faction of the Maoist Party than the one that fought in the Civil War, and that's just very recent. And this is, again, like literally a few kilometers away from where I saw this bus. So there's this sense of the kind of glorification of the US as a symbol of global prosperity and development, at the same time as there's a real pushback against it through internal politics. And then, of course, there's the fact that the Trump administration, Trump 2, has significantly curtailed international aid. And when this cutting of this program was on the table last year, people were really, really upset because tens of thousands of jobs and local economies are now funded by this US investment in Nepal, which has already begun. Thankfully, it has been allowed to continue till 2028, so there's a little bit of a stay of execution there. But this kind of shows how complex it is, that in the same area you can have that sense of aspiration to be like the US, political protest against direct US investment, but then the real economic reliance on it once it begins. So that's a little kind of window into where things stand right now. So finally, I just had a couple of slides just as by means of acknowledgement. These are all of the different collaborative research projects I've been involved in over the last several years, which this research and kind of overarching story that I've told come out of. So I won't speak to each of them, but these are some of the broader partnerships that I've been really fortunate to be engaged in. This is the last one about landsliding that I mentioned. And then I did finally want to mention that I also coordinate the Himalaya program. I'm one of the faculty coordinators of the UBC Himalaya program. And we actually have an event coming up next week. So if anybody's interested in exploring this particular world region further, please come along. Otherwise, you can also sign up to our mailing list. And I also am involved in coordinating UBC's Disaster Resilience Research Network. That's not focused on Nepal or the Himalayas. It's on this theme of research in general. So those are other resources to check out. And then finally, if you want to know more about any of this, you can check out my website for LinkedIn. So thanks for listening. And I'm happy to talk further and answer any other questions you might have or hear your comments. Yeah.
Sorry, before that,
Okay.
I'll just say, if you guys are gonna ask questions, just speak into the mic. Yeah, here you go.
Hello. Just a few things. It was really interesting because, I mean, I'm doing history and anthropology, and then every single time it's like, it's not a novel idea because it's basically just like history repeats itself, but it's really interesting to keep seeing reflections of ourselves in every part of the world. Like the boxes with all the labelings is very reminiscent to me of the Marshall Plan during World War II when the States was sending all the boxes and the huge just like depictions of the country's names, of also like pictures of the country to make it seem like give this idea of who they are. But then also like in BC itself, a lot of our interior roads were not only built on like Japanese Canadian labor, that's a separate thing, but the idea that a lot of them were built because of hydropower or this desire for infrastructure. So like in Kitimat, that was all like, that area is entirely this idea of this glorified idea of they wanted to develop and become a developed nation. So it's always so interesting to see that. That's just a comment. But my question was, I'm half Japanese, and my hometown in Japan was hit like very hard during the tsunami and earthquake. And a lot of people that my mom grew up with are still in temporary homes from 2011, like just box houses. The government had promised to put in money to help build new housing and things like that, but obviously that hasn't happened. But instead they've been putting money into building like a new rugby stadium to promote, they're saying it's to promote tourism to the rural areas, and they're trying to make it more popular for tourists to go to. But a lot of people feel as though that's just a government like abuse of relief funding. So do you think similar things have happened in Nepal with that use of relief funding? Because I just feel like that often does happen in disasters.
Thanks. Yeah, so lots of really good points there. And I do think like this general kind of analysis that I'm doing is also very applicable to BC. And like I said, I'm doing research here now as well. And I think particularly the linkages between infrastructural development, hydropower, road building, and also in a sense, the question of who owns it and who are the resources for, and that's particularly an issue here in relation to indigenous communities. That question is also there in Nepal, so good thinking. And yeah, I mean, I'd like to look more into that here as well. Yeah, and in terms of your question, I mean, Japan is usually seen as being one of the world leaders in terms of disaster preparedness as well as response. But yeah, I had a chance to spend some time in Japan last spring, and we had a workshop around anthropologies of disaster with Japanese colleagues who are looking at similar kinds of questions. And I know that there's a lot of frustration. I think you were talking about the 2011 triple disaster, right? So, and that's even a longer time ago now than I think 15 years, right? So yeah, I think these sort of perversions of intention do happen quite commonly. I don't know that particular case, but yeah, and in the Nepali context, certainly there have been many things like that where there have been allegations of corruption or embezzling of funds that were meant to go to one or the other kind of infrastructural reconstruction. And part of what happened after the earthquake, or what happens after any major disaster, is in a way there's almost this this boom where suddenly there's tons of money flowing into an area, which is really good because you need it to do that work, but it's also hard to manage because everything's happening so fast. And I think those kind of outcomes are more common than we'd hope for. Yeah.
So who?
Yeah, as an econ student, I just would like to provide some insight into that. I would say governments and country leaders always want to follow the money, especially in Japan where the economy has been struggling for decades maybe. I think that's where the intentions are always going to go, even if it doesn't seem ethical. As far as my question though, I was wondering, you brought up a U.S. investment in Nepal.
Mm-hmm.
The way you see it, do you feel that it is exploitative, like what we've seen in a lot of African countries? I mean, even recently in Sudan and things like that. Do you think it's because an investment, there's always a return, they're looking for a return. Do you think that it's, they're looking to exploit those resources or things like that, a country, or is there genuine, connection that they're looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's some of both. And I think this year it's even harder to answer that question than before, because for a long time there were lots of critiques of USAID. Now USAID is gone and suddenly everybody misses USAID. So it's hard because, like I said earlier already, and this again is part of the global entanglement here, countries and communities do rely on these resources. So it's not so easy just to say we want it all out, because once it's gone, then you have to have some other source of income and employment and so forth. So that's one of the complexities. I mean, in terms of intentions, it's very well known and well historically documented that particularly U.S. engagement in Nepal, but also other countries, is also geopolitical in nature. It's strategically situated between India and China, but it is a neutral country, so it's a really important listening post. So the MCC also has to do with the U.S. Indo-Pacific Compact, I think is what it's called. So there are clear diplomatic objectives, which has to do with, okay, we'll give you money, and then we want you, as in the government of Nepal, to give us certain kinds of information and access to certain locations and kinds of data and information. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we can take two more questions. We'll go here and then.
Do you want to? Why don't we collect all the remaining questions, and then I could speak to all of them? Is that okay? Yeah, because that'll just be more efficient. Yeah.
Oh, all right. Thank you. So first, thank you very much for your presentation, and I think it's both in depth and also easy to understand. And as for my question, and how do we understand the relationship between development and colonization? Mm-hmm. Because I think there are two aspects. The first one is constructive aspects. But the second one is also destructive aspects. So the colonization maybe brings some advanced technologies or some other concepts or cultural, maybe we cannot say advanced, but to the certain kind of nations and have an impact. I think there are actually objectively speaking, like some of the positive impacts to them, but also it also like destroys some of their cultures, their original industries or something like that. So as for because the development is kind of core concept of it's core subject here. So and based on the presentation, we learned the complexity of development because it's not a linear process. It's like several. It has several directions. It's a process. So how to understand the relationship between these two things?
Yeah, thank you. Development and colonialism.
Yeah.
Yes.
Development and colonialism.
So my question is on the other side of development, because a lot of the development we talked about is initiated from another country, for example, the US, and because I work in healthcare, a lot of the patients are complaining about our shortage of healthcare resources when they see, for example, activities like Doctors Without Borders. They're telling me that why are we sending doctors away when we are currently short of doctors? And I feel like something like this, is actually doing the opposite of the initiative, that people are more skewed towards the against part of international help. So I'm just wondering whether someone is actually looking into this problem, or is there anything the government can do on our side as the help giver to sort of resolve this conflict between the internal and external?
Any more questions? Okay. So colonialism and development and this sort of
I just want to show you one other photo from a different slide deck. So let me just see. I think I should be able to pull that up quickly, which just links a couple of these things. Maybe not. Let's see here. So what I just want to say is that there are many development actors in Nepal. I happen to be talking about the US and USAID, but China is one of the most significant development actors from the state-to-state level in Nepal right now. And that also does connect with questions about colonialism because, okay, so this is, wait a minute. Not the right one. I'll just leave it then. Basically, I have a photo, which maybe I'll pull up in a minute when I'm going to focus on it, of some of the China aid signboards in the same area. And so heavily invested in hydropower, road building, also education and other domains. And so there is a sense, I think, for Nepal of having part of the country's whole sense of national identity is about maintaining independent and not colonized. It was never colonized during the typical colonial era that we think about, or the era of colonization. And that's a really important part of Nepali nationalism that's in contrast to India to the south. At the same time, it's constantly subject to influence from both India and increasingly from China, as well as from all of these other global powers. So it's important there to see it as this kind of complex field. And I really want to be clear that I don't see it as only like the West and the rest. I see this as a kind of multinodal space where many governments around the world are also using development dollars, particularly for infrastructure, in order to achieve other kinds of objectives. And China has its own goals in the region as well, which have to do with creating a bulwark vis-a-vis India, given those two countries' long-term conflict, as well as managing the flow of Tibetans in and out across the Himalayan border. But so in kind of broader terms as well, like one could see any of those powers as having colonial interests in Nepal. And like China has actually had some border incursions, and India as well, and there are these ongoing debates over the map and territorial sovereignty. So in a way, that's quite a live issue. Also, when we think about like development as a whole, there's a lot of analysis of it as neo-colonial. So there's a critique of development as a neo-colonial form of global engagement, that it's just sort of like, whitewashing that same kind of relation of power of certain countries who have capital and political influence, enforcing those kind of ideals and ideologies on other countries who may not have that. So you can see that. And people will talk about that as a neo-colonial relation. In Nepal, there's also discussion around internal colonialism, like the government of Nepal itself using the power of the state to enforce development projects in certain areas which may be at odds with indigenous or other marginalized communities' aspirations. And so in that kind of context, often you'll hear terms around like neo-colonialism as well. And yeah, the power of development is a very useful vector through which to transmit ideological and political ideas as well in all of these different ways. Now, you asked something about healthcare, and like I think you were asking how to manage, like was it the shortage in healthcare providers and access? Right. And when you say our, are you talking about Canada? Yeah. I mean, I think that's an important question right now, especially because, like we're seeing these cuts in international development aid from the US, also from many European countries and others. And I think that's a kind of question that's being asked by a lot of people, like, why should we be giving money to other countries when, that's what you're saying, right? When we don't even have enough resources or to support our own people. So I think that is complicated. It's a question about inequality, but it's also a question about how you think about equality on a global scale instead of just within one particular national framework. And one of the arguments I like to make around this too is that we, or whoever the we is, like, the ego that's giving development funding, also learns from those experiences. So it's not a one-way affair. And in my kind of broader work right now, one of the things I'm really engaged in is trying to think about how we bring knowledge from the global south, Nepal, but not only Nepal, into conversations here around things like disaster preparedness. Because actually a country like Nepal that's gone through everything that I've just shared with you actually now has a pretty robust system of disaster governance also at the local level through this transition to local governance that I mentioned earlier. And so I'm involved in several conversations here where I'm trying to kind of bring those models from Nepal as like a opportunity for learning, for instance, for our provincial Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. So that's also a kind of argument that you can make, which is to say that development engagement is not just about like give money and never see it again. It's about creating relationships between countries, and that's really an important way in which ideas and knowledge flow.
Okay, I think that's about all the time we have for tonight. Could we please give one more round of applause?